Why is it that menstruation, arguably one of the most natural forms of bleeding and one that perpetuates the human species, still is so taboo around the world? What is it about this form of bleeding that is so dangerous that it still remains largely hidden behind the cultural curtain? And more important, why do so many women still feel so ashamed of their periods? 6 years ago, I began to ask myself these questions. And in particular, I really wanted to know why I feel so ashamed of my period and of my menstruous body. And these questions have taken me down this really deep, really complicated, and sometimes dark path filled with anger, filled with rage, and a lot of grief. But ultimately, I'm finding it's leading me to my path of inner healing. My name is Dr. Annalisa Durr. I'm a goddess scholar, Mary Magdalene devotee, and ritual theater performer. And welcome to Journey to the Goddess TV, where I teach women how to fall in love with their own authentic womanhood from the inside out. Today, I have a very special edition of Journey to the Goddess TV. I will be giving an extended, expanded version of my doctoral presentation on my work with menstruation, and that will be followed by a Q&A and a panel discussion with me. So I will be on the hot seat today, and I'm really looking forward to that. Before I introduce our guests and before we get into it, I'd like to just give a few housekeeping notes. First, I will be timestamping this video so that you can find the beginning of the presentation and also the beginning of the Q&A. Number two, I will also be giving links to the videos that I mentioned during the presentation that I can't technically show because of copyright issues, but that'll be in the text box, the YouTube text box, for you to click on those links to view those short videos at your leisure. And number three, there will be an extensive works cited and reference section at the bottom of the YouTube text box, which is where I typically list all of my references. So now you know for future reference, it's there and it will be there this time too. And number four, I want to give a special thank you to everybody who is currently subscribed to my channel. Thank you so much. And if you're not subscribed, why not? Don't miss your opportunity. It's free and you're here now, so you might as well subscribe and like this video, leave a comment, share with friends and anyone you think would be interested in this content. And truly, we're really trying to get a conversation going today. This is kind of an experiment of creating a roundtable, red tent, if you will, but this is YouTube, so everyone is invited to the table. So please engage and please share. And now I would like to introduce my esteemed guests, Dr. Odette Springer and Dr. Stephanie Zachowski. First, at the bottom of my screen, at least, is Dr. Odette Springer. Dr. Odette is a writer, filmmaker, and classically trained musician. She has been a singer and songwriter and composer for over 25 films for such companies as HBO, Showtime, Paramount Studios, and the Disney Channel. Her first feature documentary, Some Nudity Required, premiered at Sundance and immediately secured worldwide distribution. In her private practice, Odette teaches methods of applying depth psychological tools, such as active imagination, dreams and mythology, to artists of all disciplines as a way to produce more authentic work. Currently, she is writing a book on trauma and the creative process and teaches writing as part of the Joseph Campbell Writers Room at Husson College in Los Angeles. Welcome, Dr. Odette.
Great to be here.
Thanks. And next, Dr. Stephanie Zachowski. Dr. Stephanie is a mythologist, communication specialist, and writing coach based in Dallas, Texas. She is co-founder of the Fates and Graces Mythologian, a conference for mythologists, founder of Soul Story Coaching, and serves on the board of directors at the Pacifica Graduate Institute Alumni Association. She holds a doctorate in mythological studies with a focus in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, and a certification in spiritual direction from Southern Methodist University. You can learn more at her work at stephaniezachowski.com
I will leave a link in the YouTube text box. Welcome, Dr. Stephanie.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you both. Okay, so now we'll go on to the presentation. So the name of my dissertation and my presentation is Re-sacralizing Female Blood, Overcoming the Myth of Menstrual Danger. So as I did in my original presentation, I'd like to continue with this dedication. First, to the woman on the left, this is Carol P. Christ. Carol was one of the founding matriarchs of the modern goddess spirituality movement. She was a feminist scholar of religion, and her essay, Why Women Need the Goddess, was really foundational to my 6th chapter, but also to my own work and life with the goddess. And then to the woman on the right, this is my godmother, Michelle. She passed 4 days after Carol, actually. And she is one of my spiritual teachers as well. And even though we're not related by blood, she is someone who gifted me with the grace of the goddess. So thank you both. I'm going to give you a presentation overview. First, we're going to cover what is the myth of menstrual danger. We will look at the prehistoric menstrual reverence in context of a goddess worshiping Neolithic Old Europe. We will look at the transition to patriarchal social systems and the development of the myth of menstrual danger. We're also going to look at internalized menstrual shame, how the myth of menstrual danger perpetuates menstrual shame through a process termed internalized sexism. And then we're also going to look at why women need a new menstrual myth. Women and other menstruators, including non-binary individuals and transgendered men, need a new menstrual myth to overcome the myth of menstrual danger. And I also want to emphasize that following the analysis of Louise Lander, I consider menstruation a biological and a social event. So the fact that we menstruate is a biological fact. And the meaning that we individually and collectively give to menstruation is a matter of ideology, story, and narrative. And to that end, I want to take a moment to talk about language for a moment, because language falls into an ideological category with biological mechanics, right? So our body still, there's a biological fastidity to how we speak language mechanically, right? But basically, it's a symbolic system that conveys a worldview. And this is important because in my analysis of Western patriarchal societies, menstruation and women have been intentionally connected for biological and social reasons, so ideological reasons, to provide evidence that women are problematic and to justify the control of our bodies and our place in society. Menstrual blood has been equated with danger, as an illness, as a symbol of death, pollution, dirt, toxicity, sin even, or simply as other, meaning something male bodies do not do, because in this worldview, the Western worldview, male bodies have traditionally been depicted as the normal standard human body. So until recently, menstrual blood has also been, with few exceptions, equated with women. Thus, women as a class have been constructed as dangerous. In other words, it is not simply menstruators who are considered dangerous, but women. Women are dangerous because we menstruate. I also believe that this is the belief that underlies menstrual stigma in modern society today. So taking away women's language and our ability to name the structures that oppress us does not help us, but only serves to obfuscate the problem and to amplify the myth of menstrual danger. So you will see I'm very intentional in how I use language in this presentation and in my work. A prehistoric evidence for menstrual reverence. Archaeologist Maria Gimbutas theorized that Neolithic Old Europeans worshipped a great goddess that was present in animal, plant, and human cycles. More broadly, Gimbutas believed that old Europeans perceived death and regeneration as interrelated phases in a process of cyclical renewal, meaning that death and rebirth were co-present events, and death would have been considered life-affirming. Gimbutas argued that in this goddess tradition, the female body emphasized the cyclical powers of life, nurturance, death, and rebirth. We can see here the example of the stiff white goddess on the left of the screen, where her breasts are de-emphasized. These are Gimbutas's notes. The breasts are de-emphasized while the pubic triangle is emphasized to amplify this death rebirth power. Then the use of red pigments, as we see here in the image in the center of the slide. These red pigments are important in how they're used and their location, which indicate the possibility of menstrual blood reverence. So red pigment is often found inside of womb-like burial structures, on female figurines and objects, and on skeletal remains, which Gimbutas has interpreted to indicate the life-giving and life-taking powers of women's menstrual and parturition fluids. Others have argued that vulvic-shaped caves decorated with red markings dating back to the Paleolithic, and also a variety of Neolithic pottery with red marked V-shapes. You can see the example over here on the right. So these red marked V shapes, the V or the inverted triangle is often a symbol for a woman or vulva, are indications of menstrual reverence. Now to the transition to patriarchal societies and the control of women's reproduction. So this is a picture of Aristotle and a quote, "The progeny that does not resemble its parents is already in certain respects a monster, because nature has to some extent departed from the generic type. The very first deviation is the birth of a female instead of a male." And I am presenting this because this really kind of is the container attitude, the container worldview with regards to women and men in the Western tradition, even into the present to various degrees. So I discussed the changing narratives on the meaning of women's role in the procreative process and their diminished status that developed in Western Bronze and Iron Age cultures. I begin with 2 points on the subjugation of women: the control of female reproductive anatomy by patriarchal states and family actors. Again, not entirely unlike what we're seeing today with regard to controlling women's choices around their reproduction and abortion rights. At the same time, I aim to illustrate the diminishment of women's procreative role in the patriarchal imagination. And again, we have to keep looking at the interplay between biology and ideology. So throughout much of Western history, men have been perceived to possess the primary quality for human generation. In the male as creator paradigm, men are constructed as the source of biological creation, that is the source of human life through their semen, and a woman's contribution to reproduction, though it was considered necessary and wildly debated as to what that contribution actually was, she was primarily seen to nurture a man's seed into a human being. So then on to the actual myth making of menstrual danger. So this is where it starts to get really fun and interesting, right? This is a quote by the Roman Pliny the Elder. And he says, "Terrible things are told about the monstrous powers of menses." And after I read this quote maybe 50 times, I went from being angry about it to thinking it was really funny. Like it almost sounds like the introduction to a horror film. And at one point I was like, was this man a satirist? And I had to Google, like, was he just being totally ridiculous about the things that he would say about the nature of woman? And I didn't really get an answer, but I think he was actually serious. Dramatic, but serious. He has many, many more quotes about menstruation that I have quoted in my dissertation as well. I also want to emphasize that I am talking about the dominant menstrual narrative in Western cultures from the 4th millennium BCE to the present. So I'm not talking about some of the subcultural narratives, or, if your mom told you that menstruation was beautiful and it was you becoming a woman. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about the dominant cultural narratives. So the concept of the myth of menstrual danger came from my analysis of early Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, and Roman religious, philosophical, and scientific medical menstrual discourses and practices. I argue that menstrual blood went from being a life-affirming, regenerative symbol to a symbol of danger that no longer represented the dual forces of life and death, like we saw in the Neolithic. So instead, menstrual blood was equated with illness, with toxicity, and other death and degeneration symbolisms. This was really made possible, I believe, because of the changing cosmological paradigm where death is no longer understood as an interrelated phase in the cycle of life that can facilitate rebirth. Instead, in the cosmologies that I explore, and following what Anne Baring and Jules Cashford have illustrated, death becomes dangerous and something to overcome. Furthermore, there are many examples of people's, things, and polluted statuses that are related to death. So these statuses are things like sex, illness, childbirth, and menstruation, and death itself. So all of this must be overcome, tabooed, or somehow contained. I also illustrate where medical paradigms have and continue to pathologize menstruation and menstruous women, even to a certain extent into the modern period. In religious paradigms, menstrual blood is often tabooed, and as such, in my view, has been constructed as an existential threat to cosmic order and human civilization. That is because the cosmos and human civilization have always been intertwined in the Western worldview. Things started to change during the Enlightenment, but you can see there are modern iterations of this in our culture today. In the ancient Greco-Roman traditions, this is fascinating. There is actually no proof of a menstrual taboo, but classicist Robert Parker argues that menstruation was considered so shameful that it was not even discussed outside of a medical context. And Jack Lennon borrows Parker's assertion to argue this for the same thing in ancient Rome. So furthermore, and I find this really fascinating, which is why I'm going to focus on this little detail, Helen M. King essentially argues that for the ancient Greeks, menstrual blood held a cosmological and social role, and that menstruation was likened to animal sacrifice. So thus, like animal blood was spilt on an altar, menstrual blood was a symbol of woman's sacrifice to maintain cosmic and human order. So from my perspective, menstrual blood was and continues to be synonymous with anti-life in the patriarchal imagination because of its connotation with death and degeneration symbolisms. So though the onset and recurrence of menstrual blood was indicative of a woman's fertility and thus her ability to carry a man's child, conversely, menses was believed to negate his life-giving seed and therefore his reproductive purpose. The very presence of menstrual blood means that no new life has occurred. Under this paradigm, menstruation has presented an ontological problem to the male as creator paradigm where women's blood must be dealt with religiously, medically, and politically. So really briefly about this image here, I use this image here because I think it really illustrates a point about the Christian tradition, even though I only talk about it very briefly in my dissertation. So this is a reference to the biblical scene in which Christ heals a woman who has a bleeding disorder, which many scholars argue, or some scholars argue, it's very likely a menstrual disorder, and that's my belief as well. So I use this example to illustrate how the myth of menstrual danger was indirectly reinforced in the Christian tradition. So the myth of menstrual danger in modern medical discourse. I track the myth of menstrual danger in Western science and medicine from the 16th century to the present. I argue that some scientific and medical menstrual discourses present menstruation as a symbolic and sometimes literal threat to human, animal, and plant life. All of these narratives continue to present menstruation as a negation and threat to life with a capital L here. So I have three examples that I focus on in this chapter. First, from Emily Martin. She's an anthropologist. She illustrates how modern medical teaching literature that was used up until the late 20th century, where again, menstruation is discussed as if it inhibits the life-giving potentialities of the sperm. In the second example, menstruation is presented as if it's toxic and can kill. So in the early mid-20th century, menotoxin theories were made famous by Bella Schick, who argued that menstruous women emit menstrual toxins that could cause death to plants and other non-human animals. All of this has been disproven as bad science. And as you can see here on the right, this is an example of one of those menotoxin experiments, not by him, but by some other doctors, David Macht and Dorothy Lubin. So this was a great accidental find, that photo. And then finally, I argue that the myth of menstrual danger is recapitulated in Elcimar Coutinho's work. He's a Brazilian gynecologist. He wrote a book called Is Menstruation Obsolete? That's the English title. And basically, the premise of his argument is that due to changed menstrual patterns in the modern era, menstruation is harmful for women's and other menstruators' health. He makes a lot of great points that are worth exploring, and I don't take issue with those points. But my central critique is that he frames his argument as if menstruation itself is problematic and as if our menstruating bodies are self-harming, which I believe is problematic and encourages women and other menstruators to distrust our bodies. Okay, so this is where it starts to get fun, more fun. Menstrual dirt and the culture of menstrual concealment. So as you see here, we have an ad series, a Tampax ad series with Serena Williams. In this chapter, I build on Mary Douglas's argument that the modern Western concept of dirt is a symbolic category equivalent to pre-modern Western and indigenous concepts of pollution. I argue that menstrual danger narrative continues today through this symbolic concept of dirt. Mary Douglas argues that, like pollutants, dirt is considered matter out of place and threatens the stability of established classification systems of order and disorder. So in my view, menstrual dirt is managed through a modern taboo system that Karen Hupert has coined the culture of concealment. In concealment culture, menstrual blood dirt must be fixed, cleansed, and contained by hygienic products and behaviors so that it does not contaminate the non-menstruous world. Concealment culture reinforces the myth of menstrual danger through various menstrual discursive practices that women and other menstruators enact on ourselves and on one another. So for example, a very easy example, language. We're back to this. Language is ideology, right? As Alma Gottlieb notes, rather than use clear biological terms, many people, women, men, everybody, but women, this is the really important point. Women use menstrual euphemisms like Aunt Flo, on the rag, the curse, the monster, that time of the month. These are used as acts of concealment in an effort to frame menstruation in symbolically veiled or culturally appropriate polite terms. Even positive affirming terms such as moon blood are euphemisms that replicate this pattern of speaking in culturally polite terminology. I want to say something really quickly about taboo, because it means something different to us today than the actual original meaning of taboo, which is actually a Polynesian word, which means to mark thoroughly. And it actually is not good or bad. The word taboo is not, the origin of it is not good or bad. It simply actually connotes a difference between sacred and profane. And so that which is taboo actually has its own power. And so it can create a destabilizing situation. And that's what makes it dangerous in and of itself. And so it has to be marked thoroughly. It has to be contained because of its inherent power. Good or bad, just simply destabilizing. And throughout most of Western culture and many other cultures, but let's just actually focus on Western culture, in this worldview where the religious sphere, the divine sphere, and the human sphere have always been interconnected. If the religious sphere, if the divine sphere, if the sacred sphere is destabilized, then the human sphere is destabilized as well. So even though these are old kind of religious concepts, to talk about taboo today means that that idea of destabilizing our society and our culture is still present, even if it doesn't have strictly religious overtones. So even while many menstrual discourses are presented as liberating and empowering, I have followed other scholars such as Jill Wood, Joan Chrysler, and Ingrid Johnston Robledo to argue that these practices are, in actuality, forms of self-surveillance and body management that normalize women's voluntary self-subjugation while reinforcing menstrual stigma and sexism. So in chapter 5, I go into some depth illustrating how through the 20th century and even in the 21st century, menstrual advertisements are these discursive practices or discursive language, ideological systems that perpetuate menstrual concealment culture and that ultimately present menstruation as an obstacle to women's liberation and empowerment. I'm going to give an example here. I'm going to elaborate on this Serena Williams Tampax ad series here. I discussed this 2009 ad series called Outsmart Mother Nature, and it features the pro tennis star Serena Williams and an anthropomorphized Mother Nature on the right side, or in green, I should say. New York Times columnist Andrew Newman recognized that Tampax broke through a menstrual advertising taboo threshold when they became the first to book an athlete of Miss Williams' currency and renown to endorse a menstrual product. While this is definitely worth celebrating, the problem, in my mind, is that the content and strategy of these ads is predicated on the myth of menstrual danger. Menstruation is constructed as an impediment to the modern woman's ability to live a fulfilling and active life, instead of framing menstruation as, say, an embodied superpower. Tampax ads convey to us that their products will help all women beat or overcome or outsmart their burdensome menstrual bodies. In other words, they sell the idea that having control and mastery over one's menstrual body is desirable, liberating, and empowering. So I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail here, but first I'm going to show my guests the commercial version. It's about a minute long, and I'm going to put the link to this commercial in the YouTube text box. Okay, I'm going to say this about these advertisements. So what is particularly striking to me about these ads is the explicit archetypal imagery that reifies a personified Mother Nature and her menstrual gift, like her red box, right, is her menstrual gift, as dangerous to the modern woman, by which the modern woman must work to fight against her great mother adversary. That to me is very frightening psychologically. The adversarial relationships set up by Tampax suggest that Mother Nature must be defeated or outsmarted if a woman is going to win at life. So as we can see here, she's depicted not as an all-powerful great goddess, she as in Mother Nature. She's not a powerful great goddess. Instead, she's an anthropomorphized, petite, saccharine sweet, yet brimming with rigidity, aging, out of touch woman, bedecked in a green Coco Chanel-esque outfit. And in this short commercial, which we just saw, basically, I want to summarize this by saying that Mother Nature is depicted as an obstacle to women's liberation. And the underlying message reinforces the stigma that menstruation is indeed Mother Nature's curse. Even when the lines are quite funny, Mother Nature is asked a question about bad blood, and she answers literally, there is a lot of blood, but none of it is bad. Sure, that's cute, but the concept itself coming out of her mouth actually reifies again this concept that, yeah, maybe this blood is bad, or at least problematic. And again, you can see how she's kind of referring to herself as Aunt Flo. So the whole sketch itself is kind of this menstrual euphemism. Let's focus a little bit more on the mythological components. And I find it fascinating how archetypal this ad actually is. The symbolic color juxtaposition of the red menstrual box and Serena's all white attire is prominent. Right? Of course, the green's in there as well. The allegorical imagery of the red box is evident and certainly is reminiscent of Pandora's ill-fated box. But it's really important to know that for the Greeks, the actual, box is a mistranslation. The actual word is jar. That's the proper English translation. And the Greek word is a pithos. And for the ancient Greeks, this pithos jar, Pandora's jar, was actually an allusion to her womb. Right. So this is definitely this box, this Pandora's box that Mother Nature is holding is actually another layered symbol of the womb and the dangers of the womb, right? The dangers of Pandora's womb. Although white is a typical color for tennis attire, her white dress replicates the pristinely clean white menstrual pads commonly depicted in menstrual product ads. Of course, we do not want to see Serena's outfit sullied by any red menstrual gift. The attire also parallels with religious systems that associate white with cleanliness and purity. And typically, ritual cleanliness means a readiness to approach the divine sphere or gods undefiled by pollution or dirt. So bringing that color symbolism and pollution concepts forward into the ad, I wonder who the gods are in this case. Are they the gods of tennis? Perhaps the gods are a combination of tennis enthusiasts, sponsors, fellow athletes, investors, owners, and advertising executives. Is Serena's perfectly clean white clothing a visual cue to these so-called tennis gods that she is ritually pure and completely undefiled by menstrual dirt, and thus she is ready to play tennis for them? And the last archetypal message I want to leave you with here is that Tampax's underlying message, in my view, is that old Mother Nature's menstrual gift is an antiquated, out of touch feminine weakness that gets in the way of a modern woman living her life. The rivalry itself is an archetypal representation of the battle between the old and antiquated matriarchal earthbound chthonic goddesses, Gaia and Chaos, that we see in Hesiod's Theogony, and their rivalry with the new modern Olympian gods led by Zeus. So some historians believe that Hesiod's Theogony, which is an ancient Greek origin story, origin of the gods and the universe, depicts the takeover of these matrifocal, matrilineal communities that existed in parts of Greece prior to the invasion of Indo-Europeans with their patricentric gods. So this is a battle in a way between matriarchal cultures and patriarchal cultures that's represented in these gods. So in the Theogony, Gaia is overcome by Zeus's strength and skill, while in the Tampax ad, Mother Nature is outsmarted and overcome by Serena. There is a distinction though. So unlike Zeus, Serena is not shown trying to assert dominance over the entire cosmos, just Mother Nature. Yet, like the feminine ills that come out of Pandora's box or her jar as punishment to mankind, and quite literally, they were believed to be a punishment to mankind, not humankind. This ad projects the antiquated idea that menstruation is a dangerous feminist weakness, as I said, that must be contained. Serena's physical might and strength, all of these that are valorized as masculine virtues, can overcome all feminine obstacles, including a very primal, very chthonic female bodily functions such as menstruation. Rather than depict Mother Nature's menstrual gift as a source of female bodily strength or womb power, Tampax is telling us that menstruation is a burden. It must be outsmarted and overcome. So now let's talk about internalized menstrual danger as menstrual shame. So although some resist menstrual culture, there are many that do. The result is that still many women and other menstruators are enculturated to feel shame, fear, distrust, and disgust for our menstruous bodies. This enculturated menstrual shame and internalized sexism generally is where my personal journey to resacralize menstruation begins. I discovered my internalized belief that female embodiment, being female, is inferior to being male. Initially, it was through dream analysis that I was able to discover this deeply unconscious internalized belief. And I was shocked to discover this about myself, particularly because the mere thought of female inferiority runs contrary to my conscious idea of myself and my beliefs about women. And I mentioned this, not just mentioned this, but I really emphasize this because I want to illustrate that I believe sexism is deeply embedded in many women's psyches. Remember, it's unconscious, so many of us are unaware of it even exists. And it's really difficult to become aware of one's own internalized sexism. And so I also want to emphasize how devastating it can be, or recognize, not just emphasize, but recognize how devastating it can be for a woman, as it was for myself, and continues to be, to come face to face with one's own internalized sexism. Very briefly here, what is internalized sexism? At its most basic, internalized sexism is when women internalize sexist narratives and events and then learn how to enact those discourses, those belief structures and behaviors on ourselves and on other women. In that way, internalized sexism is a horizontal oppression that reinforces the status quo. It doesn't need necessarily only outside oppressive structures because it's hooked us from the inside. It is usually unconscious, which correlates with my own experience. And in a number of studies, internalized sexism and misogyny have been shown to have negative effects on mental health across diverse groups of women. And as I have argued in my dissertation, internalized sexism and misogyny contributes to women's internalized menstrual shame. So now, a new menstrual myth. This is a beautiful quote from Ntuzake Shange. We need a God who bleeds now. So why we need a new menstrual myth? In Carol P. Christ's essay, Why Women Need the Goddess, she argues that goddess symbolism has vital political and psychological value for women. We need the goddess because we live in a culture where, quote, religious symbols affirm the ubiquity of male power, leadership, and dominance, end quote. And the goddess and female center images, in her view, quote, affirm female power, the female body, the female will, and women's bonds and heritage, end quote. So most important for my remythologization of this myth here, is that menstruation is a female power that is imagined as creative and generative, and thus is legitimized as beneficent rather than as dangerous and hazardous. The female body is also legitimized through the normalization of this life cycle, both its literal and symbolic meaning of birth, growth, decay, death, and rebirth, which I see replicated in the phases of the menstrual cycle. In my approach, the bleeding phase of the menstrual cycle can be understood as both a symbolic pattern and a literal process that mediates between death and rebirth. At the level of the culture, the function of my remythologization is to recover and reconstitute what has been lost in modern Western patriarchal societies. A sacred menstrual narrative that affirms menstruation as a normal female bodily process, as well as an extraordinary embodied power that connects us to the awesome and ultimately unknowable mysteries of creation. So I find it imperative, absolutely necessary, to employ goddess symbolisms in the creation of a new menstrual myth, which provides those of us who are female embodied with affirming meanings about menstruation. Okay, so to the myth itself. So an overview of this remythologization of the ancient Sumerian myth, the descent of Inanna, as a psychosomatic menstrual cycle journey. There are two layers of the remythologization that I play with. First, I remythologize the myth itself. Basically, I argue that the version of this myth that we have access to has a lot of obvious patriarchal overlays and additions that seem to intentionally depotentiate, take away the generative potentialities of the two sister goddesses, Inanna and Ereshkigal. Thus, my remythologization at the level of the myth serves to repotentiate these goddesses with their life-giving and life-generating powers. And I will leave a link to this myth as well in the YouTube text box. Now to the psychosomatic menstrual cycle journey. I equate the storyline and the mythical figures with the biological and the psychological menstrual experiences. I integrate the experience of internalized menstrual shame into this remything, and I offer a way to actively engage with this menstrual shame in order to heal it, or at the very least, make it conscious. So before I detail the 4 sections here, I actually want to play you ladies a video. Again, the link to this video I'll also provide in the YouTube text box. So I wanted to show that because just to give an idea of how extraordinary, like all of the things that are happening inside of our body during the menstrual cycle, and that's just the most basic, right? But it's like what's happening in the head and the ovaries and the uterus, right? And they're all happening simultaneously. It is actually extraordinary that new life can act, that pregnancy can occur based on how many things could actually go wrong. The ovaries and the fallopian tube aren't even connected, so I just wanted to show that to kind of emphasize how complex the menstrual cycle actually is and how involved the whole body is with reproduction, or the menstrual cycle itself. Basically here, at the outset of this myth, we have phase 1, when Inanna hears the call of the great below. See, so we have that down here at the bottom on the left side. And she's queen of heaven and earth. She's at her fullest potentiality when she hears this call of the great below beckon her. And I have equated this moment of the myth to the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle, when the ovarian follicles fully ripen one ovum On rare occasions, there can be more. And they prepare this egg for its ovulatory journey through the fallopian tubes down into the uterus. Phase 2, descent. You can see that here to the left in the luteal phase. And Nana prepares to descend to the underworld, which is ruled by her sister, the underworld king, Ereshkigal. Then Inanna must strip all of her sacred powers from her body and leave them at the threshold of the underworld. These life force powers are specifically associated with feminine power in Sumerian mythology. And in doing so, Inanna is basically defenseless against death. So the equivalent, again, is the luteal phase. It's comparable to her underworld journey when the egg is traveling down the fallopian tube toward the uterus. Unless the egg joins with the sperm in fertilization, it dies and it dissolves. And like Inanna, when she's stripped of her upper world life-giving powers, the egg is divested of its life-giving potentialities. Phase 3, death. You can see here at the top on the left is equated with the menstruation, the actual bleeding phase. So quite simply, in this phase, Inanna is killed and hung on a hook for 3 days and 3 nights. And I equate her death with the menstrual bleeding phase of the cycle. In the absence of conception, the uterus prepares to shed the uterine lining and bleed, and the whole process will start over again. In the myth, we find Inanna's dead body, and we also see her sister Ereshkigal in the midst of labor, both of which evoke this imagery of death and life as co-present. Menstrual blood connotes death. The appearance of blood signifies that no new life has been conceived, and the disintegration and purging of the endometrium lining is a literal death of bodily tissue. However, menstrual blood also connotes life. Science has discovered that menstrual blood contains regenerative stem cells, and the presence of blood signals the potential for new life. So part of this remything is actually repotentiating menstrual blood as containing this paradox of death and life. Finally, phase 4, Inanna's descent and the follicular phase on the right-hand side. In this part of the myth, Inanna comes back to life and is given permission to return to the upper world. The follicular phase is the regenerative process of the ovaries and the uterus. After the endometrium is shed and menstruation has finished, the ovarian follicles are stimulated to produce a mature egg. Acknowledging menstrual blood's material and symbolic potencies can enable women and other menstruators and all people to find positive, affirming meanings in menstrual blood and the menstrual cycle. The last lines of the myth read, "Holy Ereshkigal, great is your renown. Holy Ereshkigal, I sing your praises." I offer a menstrual equivalent. Holy blood, great is your renown. Holy blood, I sing your praises. Final thoughts. I want to leave you with this. It is estimated that 800 million women, girls, and other menstruators are actively menstruating every day of the year. Imagine what would happen if each of us accepted and even celebrated our menstruation and menstruous bodies. What would that world look like? Thank you. That's my works cited. Again, that'll be in the YouTube text box. Thank you. So I'm really thankful to have Dr. Stephanie and Dr. Odette here today to put me in the hot seat, ask me some questions, and also for us just to have a general conversation about menstruation. We were talking earlier about kind of creating a red tent, kind of red circle, red table base here where we can talk about my topic, but also just talk with each other and maybe spark some conversations outside of this YouTube discussion. So would either one of you like to go first?
I have some questions prepared, but I am so intrigued by the question that you left at the end of the presentation of what would a world look like if we welcomed our bodies in that way. And it harkens me back to a conversation we had a while ago, and this has stayed with me, where you talked about your work with the internalized sexism and just how do I know what a true experience of being in this body is without everything I've been encultured to understand about myself? And leaving that question like you did at the end of the presentation, I'm struck again by that. How do we know what that is and what might we imagine into that looking like.
Yeah, I mean, as you were just saying that now, I'm like, I was thinking, I was like, is it even possible to ever know? I mean, is there even just one thing? Is there one knowing of self? I mean, there's all of these different versions of self too. Yeah, it's totally, it's just a fascinating unraveling question, because I think it's a lifelong quandary, lifelong question. I don't know if it can ever be answered, or if there is only one answer, and certainly probably not for everybody. Each of us has to find that answer within ourselves, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
I was struck by the same thing at the end. I mean, I've heard it, you talk about it before, and I was thinking, geez, we have Independence Day and we have all of these days. I mean, what would it look like? I can't even fathom what it would, that it would exist, but Menstruation Day as an honoring of women.
Yeah. And I'm like seeing that day, like we're all just like free bleeding.
But we wouldn't be bleeding all together, and there's many of us that aren't bleeding anymore, and there are children,
Right.
but it's just an honoring of a day,
Yeah.
of an aspect of a cycle.
I actually wonder if there's some kind of like menstrual equity day. There's something related to menstruation day, but of course nobody knows about it except for people that are in the field of, menstrual equity and studies. It's day, kind of, but nobody knows.
Yeah. And I also, to your answer to your point, Stephanie, I was thinking of, that's been my quest as well with my film. And before my film, I was doing a process called Continuum, which is kind of a free form dance that's very in tune to your own process. So it's not really, it's whatever your body's wanting to do. And my quest has been, because of my own history and because of where I'm born, what does it mean to be in this body? What does it mean to be a woman? And after all of this work that I've done, I actually had a thought this morning about this as I was going to the market, which is taking perhaps a more Buddhist perspective, which is, this is the body that I have. These are my thoughts. There's patriarchal thoughts, there's matriarchal thoughts, there's self-hatred, there's self-love. And what if I just allowed it all to be and allow nature? Because when we don't interfere, and Alan Watts talks about, I was listening to an Alan Watts talk last night, when we allow nature to take its course, it will unfold and we will know. So that's just where I am this morning. Very different from maybe last week, where, I would be more in a fighting stance, or, because really we're no longer these goddesses, these matriarchal gods. We've gone through too much change. Just as like animals are no longer feral. Like my cat is no longer a feral. He has remnants of it, but he's no longer. So what if we just have to accept that we are very influenced by patriarchy? I mean, I read that in your dissertation, and I made a note for myself in terms of the internalized sexism. When I went back to look at my film from a depth psychological point of view, I was horrified when I discovered that I actually devalued women. And I put men on a pedestal, as if, even though I was railing against them, I still valued films by men more, opinions of men more, whether I would either fight against them or align with them. They were still more powerful than the women who I was trying to support, including myself. So I was horrified that it's actually this biblical idea, of the woman being subjugated, or it's one of the interpretations. There's other interpretations, but that's the interpretation that I internalized. So I totally related. I relate to everything in your work, and that's why I feel like it's so important, because I think so many women do.
Thank you.
We don't know it. It's called internalized.
Yeah.
Because we don't know it, and talking about it I
Right.
think is the best thing that we could do.
I think so too. And like acceptance that it's probably there to some degree or another. It doesn't matter how feminist you are on the outside. In fact, in my own case, I would almost hazard a guess that my own outward appearance of feminine, being activist feminism in my own way was actually indicative. The more I became like that, the stronger the internalized sexism was. It was like the polarity between the outward, support women activism and that level of self hatred for being a woman. And so it was almost like I had to get to those extremes in order to even be able to notice, to find internalized sexism inside myself. So and I'm now in a place where I just start talking about my own process, because I personally believe that most, if not all, women have this inside of us to some degree. In different areas, it might look different for each one of us, depending on our personal upbringing and our cultural upbringing. And that just me telling my story, hopefully can, trigger something for other people. It's kind of something self-reflective in other people. So acceptance is part of it, accepting that it's there, and you can choose to investigate it and do something about it if you want to or not. And I guess part of my acceptance where I'm at with that now is that it's a long process. It's a long process to unravel it, to heal from it. Maybe the shame is always going to be there. I was kind of hoping by the time I finished the dissertation, the shame would be gone. Nope. But it's lessened. It's lessened. I had this experience earlier this week. I bled, and it's not TMI for you two, for everybody else, who cares, but this is part of reclaiming it. This is part of reclaiming it, talking about it. I bled so much in a 24-hour period, pun intended, that I bled through my pants twice in one day, even with the period underwear. And I was at like this coffee shop. I'm not sure if I actually bled there or not. Like, I got home and I was like, oh my God, holy cow. And I know I'd mentioned it to you later on that day, or the day after, Odette, and I was like, you know what? I'm actually like too busy, A, to feel ashamed about it. And B, I actually think that this work that I have been doing has reframed it for me, that there was a little bit of shame, but not like there would have been in the past. So that actually showed me that this is working, that the work that I've done has worked on my psyche to some extent.
I think it's so interesting, just your awareness and your consciousness around it seems to like change the way you meet it. And as these things come up, I think what I'm struck by in this whole conversation is when you were building on Susan Bordeaux in your chapter, and you were talking about, just defining internalized sexism, which you do so beautifully, like, because it's like, I don't know, when you're reading through it, you're like, oh yeah, that's that. Oh yeah. I mean, it's just completely unconscious, and you're explaining how, it's self-inflicted by body management practices, which I think is just a very interesting, because that's such a tactile thing that, I manage my body all the time in specific ways. And none of those are bad. I'm not, but the fact that is subjectively, and this is quoting, experienced in terms of power and control over the body, and particularly the way that is done with menstruation, and but so many other aspects as well, and who's defining how that control is asserted, and what should be controlled, and what, just like Odette was saying, what just is, what is just welcomed as this is the beingness of me being this being, and how we meet that. I think that's an interesting awareness of just, what am I managing right now, and am I really wanting to manage that?
Right. And that's the thing, is it's not just menstruation, right? That's just one thread. And men also have things that they have to manage. We all do, everybody, right? That's the societal container, and that's what, so these, and just for the audience who hasn't read the dissertation, Stephanie was talking about Susan Bordeaux, who's a feminist thinker, and she was forwarding theories by Michel Foucault on, discursive power structures, right? And Yeah. And so that what I found really interesting in reading her work and some of the other feminists I quote is that power doesn't necessarily have to be enforced physically from the outside, because it's done inside, it's internalized.
I'm glad you're bringing that up too, because I made a note while you were talking about empowerment. And when I saw that Serena Williams, that muscle thing that, like, yeah, I realized that we have to remythologize a lot of ideas. And one of them is empowerment. I mean, what is empowerment?
Right.
Because in that commercial, empowerment is basically fighting Mother Nature, right? So that we don't have to stop, so that we can work 24/7, that we will never lose. That's not really empowerment.
Right.
But it may be one aspect. Maybe I don't know what it's like to be a man. Maybe that's when you're at war. Maybe that is empowerment, win and lose. So maybe that's one aspect of empowerment, but we're certainly missing the rest of the ideas of what empowerment is.
Right. I also, something struck me as you were saying that too. I also want to make sure, and I think I do this in my dissertation, but I don't feel like I did it in my presentation. And that is to acknowledge that there are many people that also deal with menstrual disturbances. So I don't want to also belittle that experience as well. I myself have my own version of that. So in terms of, managing one's body, it could be managing one's menstruous body so that one, can go to work and pay their bills, So there's also a practicality that we just have to be present to in the culture, the society that we live in today. So I want to make sure to say that too, because
Absolutely.
I don't want to dismiss PCOS or any of the other
Well, I had fibroids and I clotted. I mean, I had cups, I'll say it, cups of blood, cups and cups of blood coming out for a long time. And I tried everything. I read Christiane Northrup and I did castor oil packs and everything that, could imagine. And finally I healed it. I'll say this too, through cabbage juice.
Wow.
I met a raw food kind of a weird person, but I tried it. And within a week I had stopped clotting.
Wow.
So that was amazing. But the shame, this dealing with menstrual disturbances, which we've talked about too in the past, we don't know where that's coming from, all of these imbalances. And it was great watching this YouTube, the piece that you showed us about all of these interactions with the pituitary gland and the ovaries. And so, we don't know what's happening in our minds that's creating these imbalances or we don't know enough about that.
Right. I mean, the body is an amazing, cosmos in and of itself. It is incredible. Sorry, Stephanie, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to represent the medical industry with, I've had some issues as well, and had a hysterectomy because of them. So what I think is so beautiful about your work and your remythologizing is how you show an embodied recreation of the anonymous, but it's also quite symbolic. And I think that, even though that's somewhat of a cavern now, I still have ovaries and I still experience ovulation, but not in the same way. I can imagine into that experience and walk through the myth, like as you develop it, really profoundly in kind of my own experience of my body as it is in its own unique ways. And I think that's part of what I see with your this self-infliction and body management, of that we each get bodies the way we get them. We each experience menstruation in very different ways, and we meet that, and we kind of have to have a relationship with that. And what does that look like? Right. And you make that look very sacred.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. The relationship with one's body might be the hardest relationship we have. During the kind of closing months of working on this project, I had two friends talk to me about some teenage girls in their lives, like
uncannily like within a month of one another, the same kind of conversation. And each one of them said, like, they were like, have you had your period yet? How do you feel about it? And, the one girl was like, oh God, I wish I just, I don't want kids. I just wish I didn't ever have to have a period. It's so annoying. And the other girl, who I actually knew since she was a baby and who's now 13, had said something like, she was very ashamed. And I started to cry because that's how early the enculturation happens. And and part of me felt bad. I was like, oh, I couldn't reach her before the negative programming happened. But how could I? I mean, the negative programming is bigger than me, So to blame myself was ridiculous, but it pained me to see it happening in real time. And try to remember what it was like for me when I was 12 or 13, struggling with this new thing for me, called menstruation.
Yes, and what it means and the responsibility that comes with it. And, your chapter on concealment, and then how you learn more from your girlfriends sometimes than any educational institutions around how to manage it, at least that's my personal experience. But
Yeah.
It is not necessarily always celebrated and taught for the value that it is, which I think is very interesting in your work, how you really carefully develop how death and regeneration are disconnected throughout history from earlier cyclical traditions, show that connection, and that is disconnected and appropriated and demonized in the different ways that's done, and how you show how menstruation actually reconnects those two components, that
Right.
they are, in order for us to regenerate as a species, death is also part of that regenerating
Right.
ability, and menstruation is the heart of that.
Right. I think symbolically too, that brings us right to the heart of what we're dealing with as a culture, and not just a culture, globally, with climate change, right? And having to, for example, I follow this guy named Sadhguru, and he's kind of on this mission to awaken people to soil consciousness, because the facts laid bare are that we only have 45 to 60 agricultural cycles left. And that within 20 to 25 years, if we continue as a globe on the trajectory that we're going, there will be enough food, mathematically, there will be enough food for everybody in the world to have one meal 3 days a week. And part of it is our inability to understand cycles and death and regeneration and biodiversity. Right. And so the cyclical nature of how life works, that we can't always be on some kind of linear projection upward, right? Like earlier we talked about these projectile rockets out into space, like, and menstrual blood represents that. It represents that death and decay, but also, and it's soil, like it is the soil, right? It's like our bodies go back into the soil to be broken down by all the microorganisms in the soil, and it's also the food for new life, and menstrual blood represents that as well. So there's all of it's its own pattern, right? So even if we don't want to look at our own self and menstrual blood, we can look at it as a pattern that's also replicated in all of these other things, social institutions or things that are just happening in the world. Does that make sense?
No sense. No, yeah. Well, in Native American traditions, their viewpoint is completely different, and all they do is they talk about the cycles and the balance between the masculine and the feminine. So those are demonstrated in their story. I don't want to say they're myths, because in particular for the Dene, it's their history. They don't consider that their myth. But changing women of the sun have to be completely syncopated and in harmony in order for for humans to even exist. So they understand that. It's just this Western culture that has broken away from that. And I was going to say too, I took another note about blood, which also relates to sex. And this is for men and women. Sex is often thought of as dirty, right? We're very puritanical. So, and then the woman is the one who is the temptress of this act. She carries this power, right? So I was wondering how much unconsciously menstruation actually reminds men of sex, which maybe inherently they feel guilty that they experience these feelings. And then you have, of course, the Madonna whore split and all of these other splits that go back to splitting off from nature,
Right.
that go back to Descartes, go back to splitting the mind from the body. So it's all connected, but I never thought of this sexuality part until this, when you were talking this time.
That's really interesting. I did have kind of like this split second when I remembered myself walking through this cafe, potentially with blood on my pants, with people seeing me walk away with blood on my pants. And I had this thought, I was like, I wonder if when men see that, if all of a sudden it triggers some kind of primal unconscious, like not necessarily sexual desire, but those kind of unconscious reproductive biological urges that drive us. If the sight of blood activates that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
you
know.
made those points so beautifully in your work, and you tied all of this, the dirt aspect, which you tied together.
Oh, yes.
All of this. Yes.
Right.
The fact that it's dirty, but then sex is also often considered dirty.
Right.
And how you bring up, it's destabilizing, which kind of reminds me back to your ideas around chaos. When you kind of look at
Right.
the cosmogonic myths of trying to keep chaos at bay.
Right.
I think that menstrual blood triggers some of those really inherent sense of fear of chaos.
Yes. It's really interesting because I did have this whole chaos thread in the dissertation that I ended up having to take out because it was just, I was like, I'm going to need 3 more years to work on this dissertation. But in the process, I was trying to educate myself on chaos theory. And I found 2 studies on the menstrual cycle through the rubric of chaos theory. And it turns out that the menstrual cycle from these studies is a chaotic system. So that is something that I would actually like to explore in more depth and connect it to those cosmogonic, whatever. I'm not very good with language. I struggle with it, pronunciation. Anyway, so yes, I would agree. And the soil, right? The soil's chaotic. That's something else we try to control. And we would try to, that's the problem, is our mastery and control over everything, right? Not us individually, but just culturally, trying to control chaos as much as possible.
I think some is necessary. I think it gets excessive when there's
we need order, right, Stephanie? We need both.
Balance.
That's the whole thing. We need the masculine and we need the feminine, and we need them to be in balance.
Yeah.
So we're out of balance, obviously.
Right. We can't have too much chaos and we can't have too much of order.
No, too much chaos doesn't work either.
Right. And too much order is like totally totalitarian.
Exactly. Well, you have Dionysus and you have,
Apollo. That's right.
I mean, this is been going on forever.
Right.
Well, and Athena and Medusa, and they're so intertwined in their archetypal
mythologies. Right. Yeah. Isn't there's sometimes a third goddess there too, Metis, right? The mother? No. Metis is sometimes connected to them.
I don't know.
I can't remember, but that would be interesting to see what that third element is. I think she's related to memory or something like that. I can't remember exactly. Something to explore later on.
Yeah, we could talk about this forever. I mean, I have so many notes. I know that we're just almost at noon. Yeah, there's so much in your work.
Oh,
so much to talk about.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I really appreciate both of you being here. I do want to honor time, but as we get ready to close here, are there any closing thoughts or any other points that you want to speak to, either of you?
I will say something because you asked me to talk about it yesterday.
Yes, perfect.
I'm going to bring it up for one reason, and it gives me hope. Because as much as I'm a product of this internalized sexism, when I was making my film, just working on the material, just like you're working on the material has changed you, which you can see in hindsight now. You can see that you're not the same. I was working, in this Hollywood underground, basically, with these highly sexist movies, and really confused myself. And I had a lot of emotional upheaval during that time and everything. And I ended up being sued by, I was sued twice. I can't remember which one, which incident it was. No, it was one of the producers sued me because he didn't like my film. He thought it was too feminist. You know, it took a feminist stance, and that wasn't the film he wanted to make. So I got a knock on the door. I was on my period. I got a knock on the door, didn't know who it was. And there were these two process servers with papers coming to serve me. And I have no idea where this comes from, because I wasn't really like a feminist, you know. I don't even know. I wasn't even trained in any of the myths or anything like that. And before I had to sign the paper. I went to the bathroom. I was bleeding a lot. I put blood on my hands. I went back to him and I put blood all over that paper before I signed it. And he had what could they do? They had to take the paper back.
And that was your signature, right? Did you actually
That
sign
was my signature. Well, then I took the pen and I wrote under that.
Okay.
And I have no idea why I even did it. And this is what I'm saying, that I have hope for our innate wisdom. That as we do whatever work we're compelled to do, you know, whatever we feel we need to do, that there is this innate wisdom that will come and guide us. Because I never did it since then. I didn't know why I did it. I was very obsessed with blood. These movies that I was working on were very bloody, and they were very violent, and they were violent against women, you know. But this idea of blood, I was really obsessed for some reason by this blood. I had no idea why. And then I signed in blood. And so, do you know what I mean? It's just like there's something in our nature that's not going to be suppressed.
I think you got it right there. There is something innate about that power that's there, whether we know it or not, consciously know it or not.
Exactly. So that I wanted to end. I mean, it's kind of a weird note to end on, but a positive one.
No, I mean, I've heard that story and I just get activated each time I hear it. But Stephanie, was that the first time you've heard that story?
That's the first time.
Yeah.
And I think when you speak about menstrual empowerment, I mean, there's an image of just that innate, instinctual.
Right. And just like, there's so many layers to it because of what the subject matter of your documentary is about, like the sexualization of violence against women and the bloody violence against women, and like subverting that through, this is the real power of life and death right here.
And there's these two big white men there, you know, with this paper I have to sign. And it was like, well, here you go.
So to everyone at home that's still watching, thank you for being here. Please please subscribe to the channel, please share, please leave comments. We want to continue the dialogue. Let us know if you like this format, because if I like this format, this is really fun for me to be able to have a discussion with my friends and my colleagues on these really important topics in ways that I think are, bringing some of our academic work to the forefront in a way that's accessible for everybody and relates it to the real world now. I have invited both Stephanie and Odette back to have future conversations about whatever topic we want to discuss, and other women as well, create a real roundtable. And I will just say right now, we're in an inverted triangle. So we've got the vulvic womb power kind of symbolism here. Again, thank you everybody so much. Thank you, Stephanie and Odette, for being here. And we'll see you all next time. Ciao.